Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a profoundly challenging and, I think, inspiring work. Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists, the case for a universal basic income, open borders, and a 15-hour workweek.
And the central question Bregman asks is, it's deceptively simple, but it just cuts right to the heart of modern economic and societal anxiety.
It really does. I mean, we live in societies that have achieved this unprecedented material abundance. He calls it the literal historical land of plenty.
Yeah.
So why do we still organize our entire lives and all our politics around these narratives of scarcity, of constant financial anxiety, and the compulsive performance of often meaningless work?
That is the core tension, isn't it? The one we have to confront. We've effectively won the battle against hunger, mass disease, and that historical grinding poverty.
We won.
But we're still operating as if we are back in, I don't know, a pre-industrial age. We're just constantly running on this treadmill of necessity. So this deep dive is built on Bregman's really provocative claim that the primary constraint on social progress today is no longer a lack of resources, wealth, or technology.
We have all the material ingredients we need.
We have it all.
Instead, the limiting factor, he argues, is a profound failure of collective imagination.
A failure to conceive of realistic, better alternatives. We are stuck.
We're stuck in an ideological rut. We just can't see past the structures that were built for a totally different age, an age of scarcity.
Exactly. Our mission here is a systems-level examination of these economic narratives that dictate power structures and outcomes across the globe. We're using Utopia for Realists as a lens.
A lens to analyze our prevailing assumptions.
Looking specifically at how our ideologies constrain what we believe is even realistically possible in the 21st century. I mean, this is about understanding the critique and the evidence.
Right.
Not advocating for a specific partisan platform.
It's about asking a very simple question. If we know there's a better way, why do we refuse to take it?
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's set the historical stage by looking at the author and the context that inspired this book. First, I think we have to introduce Rutger Bregman himself. He's a historian and a journalist.
Yeah, and that blend is absolutely key to the book's power.
It is. His training allows him to synthesize this vast historical data, spanning centuries, with really sharp contemporary reporting and economic analysis.
He doesn't just look at the economic charts of today. He understands the long, often painful historical conditions that created them.
And that historical scope is just. It's essential to grasp the core premise of the book.
Which is fundamentally a response to this widespread social and political disillusionment.
You feel it everywhere.
You do. Bregman observes that radical ideas for beneficial systemic change have become, in his words, almost literally unthinkable in modern politics.
It's like we've all collectively decided that the best we can possibly hope for is just managing the current decline.
Precisely. Politics in this climate, it's been reduced to mere problem management, technocracy. We've lost the ability to dream of fundamental positive change because we're constantly told that what sounds good on paper is just. It's unrealistic or unaffordable.
To understand how self-limiting that lack of imagination really is, you have to look at how far humanity has actually come in material terms.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, think about the past, not just 100 years ago, but centuries ago. Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes described human life as perpetually nasty, brutish, and short.
And Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, he called life one giant vale of tears.
And that wasn't just, philosophical gloom.
No, it was statistically accurate for most of human history. I mean, consider the economic stagnation that historians cite. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
The average annual income in Italy remained stagnant at roughly $1,600, adjusted for modern purchasing power.
Okay.
From the year 1300 all the way to 1870.
600 years. Think about that for a second. The scope of that, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration.
Newton developing physics, the entire Enlightenment.
And the average person's ability to feed themselves or their family, their essential economic reality, had not measurably improved at all.
It was a flat line. That's the baseline. It was only in the last 200 years, right around 1880, with the Industrial Revolution kicking into high gear.
That's when everything changed.
At a stupendous, almost unbelievable pace. The growth has been explosive. Extreme poverty, which today we define as living on less than $1.25 a day.
Right.
That was 94% of the world population in 1820. Today, it's below 10%.
We're talking about an economic shift that makes all of prior human history look like a statistical anomaly.
It does. The global economy is now 250 times larger than it was before the Industrial Revolution.
And worldwide life expectancy has doubled since just 1900.
To put a really concrete comparison on this progress, Bregman points to the Gapminder chart data. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Even the poorest countries today, like, say, Sierra Leone in 2012, they actually outperformed the wealthiest countries of 1800, like the Netherlands or the U.S., in terms of average life expectancy.
Wow. So our baseline of human welfare has been radically, completely redefined.
Absolutely.
So we are literally living in what the medieval world imagined as the land of plenty, or what do they call it? Cocaine.
Cocaine, yeah. A mythical paradise where all the necessities of life were just abundant. And we're there. We have the technology to feed everyone, clothe everyone, cure the vast majority of deadly diseases.
And this is the critical context for the book's core premise. We are living in a place of material abundance.
So Bregman argues many social problems persist, not because the solutions are technically impossible or fundamentally unaffordable. We have the wealth, we have the tech.
But because our outdated narratives, our ideologies, prevent us from believing that fundamental systemic change is realistic or even achievable.
The problem isn't the impossibility of the solution, it's the plausibility of it.
The plausibility within our current ideological framework.
Exactly, and that leads to a really crucial distinction Bregman makes about the word utopia itself.
Right. He contrasts the dangerous blueprint utopia.
Like the rigid authoritarian systems dreamed up by thinkers like Campanella in his City of the Sun.
Yeah, that distinction is really important for you to get. The blueprint utopia always fails because it tries to provide a finished, perfect picture that has to be imposed on everyone, often through coercion.
Whereas the guidepost utopia, which was championed by Thomas More, whose original utopia was a critique of 16th century English society,
Right.
it's fundamentally a tool for criticism. It holds up an inspiring, achievable ideal that just sparks the imagination.
And allows people to see the absurdity and the arbitrariness of their current constraints.
Exactly. The ultimate goal, as Bregman puts it, is not a finished utopia, but a world where imagination and hope are alive and active.
Let's transition now to the core ideas that Bregman uses as these guideposts for a more humane and effective system.
And the first one is the paradox of progress and the subsequent critique of work.
We achieved the medieval fantasy of cocaine. We're rich, safe, and healthy, but now we face this profound dilemma.
This is what he calls the bleak paradise moment. We've solved the problems of material scarcity, but we've replaced them with a crisis of meaning.
I think the political theorist Francis Fukuyama suggested that once ideology ends, we're just reduced to economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems.
Yeah, and Bregman argues that we now lack a reason to get out of bed in the morning that isn't tied directly to the performance of labor.
We are materially fulfilled but psychologically anxious, and this leads directly into the bullshit jobs thesis, which was popularized by the anthropologist David Graeber.
Right, and Bregman draws very heavily on Graeber's thesis.
Which suggests that a vast and increasing number of jobs, maybe 40% of them, are considered pointless or superfluous, even by the people who are paid to do them.
Let's unpack this with some of the examples Bregman points to.
Please.
Think about telemarketers, social media strategists, mid-level corporate compliance officers, or, certain high-level corporate lawyers whose work is purely adversarial.
The work is sophisticated, for sure. It's complex, but its actual contribution to human flourishing is questionable at best.
And the crucial distinction Bregman highlights is between wealth creation and wealth shifting.
Okay, let's define those.
Wealth creation is the production of tangible societal value, food, medicine, infrastructure, education.
Things we need.
Things we need. Wealth shifting is just moving existing resources from one bucket to another, often through complexity and arbitration.
He uses that powerful example of the 1968 New York City sanitation strike to illustrate this.
It's a perfect example. When the garbage crews went on strike for 9 days, the city was buried in 100,000 tons of refuse. The mayor declared a state of emergency.
The value of their work, its essential nature, was immediately and tangibly proven. You couldn't ignore it.
Now contrast that with an imaginary strike by, say, Wall Street private equity lawyers or lobbyists or social media engagement consultants.
It's pretty unlikely a state of emergency would be declared.
Not at all. These jobs primarily shift wealth around or even destroy it instead of generating tangible societal value. And yet, bizarrely,
these are the jobs that net the best salaries.
exactly, while essential workers, Nurses, sanitation workers, teachers are paid modestly.
It's a systemic paradox, isn't it? The richer and smarter our society gets, the more room there is for highly paid, highly credentialed bullshit.
We are rewarded for complexity over utility. And the collective anxiety this causes, the subconscious knowledge that our 40 or 50 hours a week are fundamentally meaningless, that just feeds the crisis of meaning.
This critique of mandatory, often pointless, labor naturally leads to the second major idea, the case for a dramatically shorter work week.
And this isn't a new fantasy. This is a forgotten prediction that the historical data actually supports.
We have to talk about John Maynard Keynes.
We do. In 1930, while the world was sinking into the Great Depression, Keynes delivered this lecture. And he predicted that by 2030, immense productivity gains, thanks to technology and compound growth, would allow humanity to comfortably adopt a 15-hour work week.
Freeing us for culture, science, and leisure.
And this wasn't some isolated fringe thought. John Stuart Mill, the father of classical liberalism, he opposed the gospel of work back in the 19th century.
Right. He argued that technology should be used to curb the work week as far as possible, allowing for improving the art of living.
He suggested that continuous competitive striving was a moral failure, not a virtue.
And historically, the evidence actually backed them up. Henry Ford famously discovered that shortening the workweek from 70 hours to 40 hours in the 1920s.
It actually boosted productivity and profitability.
It gave workers time to consume the cars they were building, and the company benefited from reduced exhaustion and increased efficiency.
Which proved that the relationship between hours worked and output is not linear at all.
Leisure time was steadily rising globally after World War II.
Yeah, in 1956, Vice President Richard Nixon promised Americans a 4-day work week in the not-too-distant future.
The historical trajectory pointed so clearly toward more leisure time as productivity increased.
So here's where it gets really interesting. Why did we stop? Why did the reduction in the work week come to a grinding halt right around 1980?
We have more technology than ever, but we're working the same hours, if not more. What happened?
The shift after 1980 is crucial. Economically, growth stopped being translated into increased leisure and was instead funneled almost entirely into increased consumption and increased labor force participation.
So two factors stand out. The entry of women into the workforce.
Meaning families collectively worked more hours and something called hour invariant costs.
Let's clarify hour invariant costs for you because this is a subtle but really powerful systemic mechanism.
Think of it like this. Many labor costs, like providing comprehensive health care benefits, managing payroll or training, are fixed. They are invariant.
You pay them per employee, regardless of how many hours that person works.
Exactly. And this fundamentally changes the math for employers. It creates a powerful incentive structure where it is much cheaper and simpler for an employer to have one person work 50 or 60 hours a week.
Often with mandatory overtime.
Than to hire 2 part-time employees who would each trigger the full set of fixed per-employee costs.
Ah, so the employer saves money by extracting the maximum hours from a single person. And that locks the individual into the rat race, even if the extra hours aren't truly productive.
Right. This structural incentive actively works against reducing the standard 40-hour week.
It's a collective action problem that forces individuals to work longer.
With managers and professionals now spending upwards of 80 to 90 hours per week, either working or just monitoring work, often enabled by the constant access granted by modern technology.
And the data confirms this long hours regime is completely counterproductive in a knowledge economy.
Yeah, Bregman highlights research suggesting that the 40-hour week is actively destructive to creative output.
Highly educated creative workers are productive for no more than 6 hours a day, often less.
Beyond that, the work becomes filler, busy work, or, bullshit. The systems are designed for quantity, not quality.
The wealthiest countries, the ones with the largest creative and educated workforces, were historically the ones that shaved the most time off their work weeks.
Because they understood the connection between reduced hours, focused work, and ultimately higher long-term productivity and innovation. We've forgotten that lesson.
The third core idea is the universal basic income, or UBI. And this is where the book makes its most profound systemic critique of how we perceive poverty.
Yeah, the core claim is revolutionary, and it directly challenges the dominant political narratives of the last 200 years.
Which is?
Poverty is a lack of cash, not character.
That's it. That's Bregman's central philosophical weapon. It completely overturns this centuries-old narrative that poverty is rooted in the moral failings or idleness or lack of education of the poor.
He argues it is purely and simply a lack of cash that dictates outcomes.
And this leads directly to the behavioral research on the scarcity mentality, which was developed by the psychologist Eldar Shafir and the economist Senthil Mullainathan.
Right, and that provides the empirical basis for the UBI proposal.
The scarcity mentality is profound because it explains how poverty acts as a cognitive tax.
A cognitive tax. When people are constantly focused on immediate lack, where the next rent payment is coming from, how to avoid the landlord, how to feed the family, it consumes mental bandwidth.
And this cognitive load imposes limitations equivalent to a staggering 13 to 14 IQ point drop.
Or the neurological effect of losing an entire night's sleep.
That is a staggering comparison. So the poor aren't struggling because they are fundamentally less capable.
They're struggling because the constant low-grade stress of financial scarcity has compromised their ability to plan long-term, to focus on education, or to utilize their full intelligence.
They're trapped in a kind of tunnel vision where they can only focus on the immediate crisis.
Exactly. And the sugarcane farmers in India experiment provided proof of this mechanism. These farmers collect 60% of their annual income all at once, after the harvest.
Okay.
Researchers tested their cognitive performance twice. When they were cash poor and stressed before the harvest, their scores were low.
Right.
When they were flush and stress-free after the harvest, their scores improved dramatically.
The people were identical. Only the context, the cash available, had changed their mental capacity and their decision-making.
So if that's the problem, the solution should be simple. Provide security, not surveillance. Give them cash.
But this is the point where the common-sense skepticism really kicks in for you, the listener. Bregman's evidence for UBI sounds compelling, but the biggest hurdle is the moral argument.
Right.
How does he squarely address that deep-seated public fear that if we give people free cash, they will inevitably become lazy, addicted, and unproductive?
He addresses this with concrete evidence from actual successful experiments, which directly contradict that laziness myth. The first key case study is the Mincome experiment in Dauphin, Canada.
Oh, this was during the 1970s.
Yes, a massive 4-year social experiment.
I remember reading about this. The conservative government that funded it eventually canceled the analysis. They packed all the data into 2,000 boxes because they believed it would show failure or just be politically inconvenient.
It's that level of ideological blindness really speaks volumes about Bregman's central thesis on the failure of imagination.
It really does.
But years later, a professor, Evelyn Forget, she reanalyzed the archives using Medicare data for comparison.
And her findings.
A resounding success that flew directly in the face of the scarcity narrative. Total work hours only dropped minimally, about 1% for men, 3% for married women.
And that drop wasn't because of laziness.
Not at all. People mostly used the basic income to take necessary maternity leave, or teenagers stayed in high school longer instead of dropping out to seek minimum wage jobs.
So the slight reduction in work was actually directed toward investment in human capital, raising healthier children, and educating the next generation. That's a huge positive externality.
It gets even better. The most significant finding was the decrease in hospitalizations. They dropped by 8.5%.
Wow.
Saving substantial money on public health care because the chronic stress related to poverty had lessened. The town became healthier, both physically and mentally. Incidents of family violence decreased.
Mincome proved that a basic income doesn't eliminate work. It eliminates bad work and improves public health outcomes.
Now let's look at an even more radical example. This one proves that even those society deems unhelpable respond rationally to trust.
You're talking about the London Broadway Homeless Project in 2005.
It's remarkable. They gave £3,000 with absolutely no strings attached to 13 chronic rough sleepers.
These were individuals who had been homeless and often addicted for decades. The state offered zero surveillance.
Think about that radical trust. The established narrative says these people would just squander the money on drugs and alcohol within days.
But what did they actually spend it on?
Their desires were incredibly modest. They bought essential items, a telephone to stay in touch, a dictionary, a hearing aid. One man, Simon, who'd been addicted to heroin for 20 years, used the stability to get clean and started taking gardening classes.
And they were thrifty, too. They averaged only spending £800 after a full year.
And that's the profound point. The policy of trust proved to be cheaper and more effective than the policy of surveillance and suspicion.
This is borne out by economic analysis, even in highly conservative environments, right?
Yeah, in Utah, they found that housing the chronic homeless with no strings attached was dramatically cheaper for the taxpayer.
It cost $11,000 per year to house them versus what, $16,000 a year to leave them on the street?
$16,670 per year, to be precise. That covers police interactions, emergency room visits, social services, court costs.
So Bregman shows that the moral argument for helping the poor and the monetary argument for efficient public spending are, in fact, one and the same.
The fourth core idea, and arguably Bregman's most controversial, is the argument for open borders.
And he frames this not as a humanitarian gesture, but as the single most powerful anti-poverty weapon available today.
It's a massive claim, and it really requires a global perspective to understand. World Bank scientists estimate that if developed nations collectively accepted just 3% more immigrants,
Which is a relatively small number.
a very small number, the world's poor would have $305 billion more to spend.
$305 billion. That figure is 3 times the combined total of all current global development aid.
So simply allowing a few more people to move is fundamentally more effective at fighting poverty than every government aid package combined.
This raises the really important question, why does the border have such a huge impact?
The answer lies in the concept of the location bonus, which highlights what he calls global apartheid. Inequality today is determined primarily by where you were born, not by your individual class or merit or education or skill.
So, if a Bolivian engineer performs the exact same work as an American engineer, even adjusting for purchasing power and skill,
The American earns nearly 3 times more simply by virtue of standing on the right piece of dirt.
precisely. Bregman notes that the wage difference for an identical worker across the U.S. border is greater than any measured form of wage discrimination, race, gender, ethnicity ever recorded within the U.S.
Which means the real economic elite of the 21st century are those born in a wealthy country, regardless of their own effort.
It frames the modern conversation about inequality in a completely different light. We obsess over income disparity within Silicon Valley, which is important.
Of course.
But Bregman shows the border itself is the greatest engine of global disparity, creating a gap exponentially larger than any national pay gap.
And this status quo is often justified by 2 persistent fallacies about immigration that Bregman just thoroughly refutes using economic data.
Okay, fallacy 1, immigrants take jobs.
The classic zero-sum metaphor. The job market is a game of musical chairs, and for every immigrant who sits down, a native-born worker loses a spot.
But the economy doesn't work that way.
Not at all. New workers increase consumption and demand. They start businesses, they buy goods, they pay taxes. They ultimately fuel economic expansion and create more jobs than they occupy.
When the U.S. saw mass migration in the late 19th century, the economy expanded dramatically. It didn't contract.
And fallacy 2. Immigrants depress domestic wages. This is the argument that low-skilled immigrants drive down the wages of native low-skilled workers.
You hear this one a lot.
All the time. But the studies, even those conducted by anti-immigration think tanks, have consistently found that immigration has virtually no measurable negative effect on domestic wages.
In fact, sometimes it leads to a slight uptick in earnings for the domestic workforce.
Exactly, because increased productivity raises the floor for everyone, including low-skilled workers. The real downward pressure on wages comes from technological shifts and the decline of labor unions, not immigration.
What's truly bizarre, and just so illustrative of failed systems, is the irony of the heavy militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border.
It's a perfect example. Bregman points out that in the 1960s, 85% of Mexican immigrants eventually returned home. Migration was cyclical.
But since the heavy militarization began in the 1980s, and especially post 9/11,
That return rate has plummeted to 7%.
why?
Because crossing the border became too expensive and too dangerous to attempt twice. The border enforcement, intended to keep people out, ended up trapping them inside the U.S. permanently.
So it created a much larger and less mobile illegal population by removing the ability to circulate freely.
The system designed to solve a perceived problem of illegal immigration actually amplified it and distorted the flow of labor. It shows how borders, which were practically non-existent a century ago, are now the ultimate and often counterproductive tool of global discrimination.
So if these ideas, UBI, 15-hour work weeks, open borders, if they're backed by evidence and promise such widespread societal benefits, why do the old systems and scarcity narratives persist so fiercely?
This brings us to Section 4, where we map the mechanisms that keep the status quo locked in place.
And we have to start with the fundamental shift in who gets paid. This underpins the crisis of inequality and meaninglessness.
We have to look at Nicholas Kaldor's historical economic fact. For decades in the 20th century, roughly two-thirds of national income went to labor.
And one-third went to capital, the owners of assets.
That ratio was treated almost like a physical constant.
But the ratio is no longer constant.
No. Bregman notes that today, only 58% of industrialized nations' wealth goes to labor. That 8% shift represents trillions of dollars moving from wages to owners of capital.
That is a seismic structural change.
And Bregman pinpoints the reason. Technological progress accounts for 80% of this decline.
This is the rise of the winner-take-all society.
Enabled by two parallel globalizing forces that began in the 1970s and 80s. The advent of the chip, Moore's Law, and the shipping container, which he calls the box.
We should spend some time on those two forces because they fundamentally altered the economy, the box and the chip.
The chip made information flow ubiquitous. It allowed a company to manage a global supply chain from a single headquarters.
And the box, the standardized shipping container, made physical transport incredibly cheap, fast, and globally integrated.
Together, they globalized markets completely. This means that a slight competitive advantage now translates into total global dominance.
You no longer need to be great in one city or one country. You need to be fractionally better than the competition globally, and the rewards are astronomical.
This is why we have fewer winners who are far, far richer than any losers.
And we see this so clearly when comparing the fate of Kodak, which employed 145,000 people in the late 80s before filing for bankruptcy.
With Instagram, which was sold for $1 billion with only 13 employees.
It takes fewer people to create a successful, highly valuable business, meaning fewer people benefit from that success through wages. Capital wins, labor loses.
And this feeds directly into the incentives for wealth shifting over wealth creation. The system rewards complexity and financial maneuvering.
There's that famous Harvard study referenced by Bregman, which showed that post-Reagan tax cuts incentivized the country's brightest minds to switch careers.
These top graduates shifted from being engineers, scientists, and teachers' professions that generate positive externalities and build real infrastructure,
to being bankers, financial product creators, and accountants, often engaged in negative externalities or pure wealth shifting. The system rewards the monetization of complexity.
And the cost is measurable. For every dollar a bank earns today, an estimated 60 cents is destroyed elsewhere in the economy due to crashes, risk-taking, or resource misallocation.
Conversely, a public researcher adds at least $5 back into the economy through innovation and positive externalities.
The incentives are literally backwards. They are systematically rewarding behaviors that harm the collective economy but benefit a select few in the capital-owning class.
Now let's talk about the narratives that justify keeping the system in place, specifically that deeply ingrained myth of laziness that prevents us from adopting UBI.
The narrative of work as moral worth is deeply historical. It traces back to the mercantilist worldview that dominated European economic thought for centuries.
The philosophy, championed by figures like Arthur Young, held that the lower classes must be kept poor or they will never be industrious.
This worldview sees poverty and anxiety as a necessary engine for cheap, productive labor.
And Bregman uses the dramatic narrative of the Spiegelman myth to show how this moral judgment can be weaponized against pragmatic policy, even when the policy is beneficial.
The Spiegelman system, started in 1795 in England, was a poor relief program. It essentially supplemented the wages of all poor and industrious men and their families up to a subsistence level.
It was an early basic income floor.
Exactly. And while it successfully reduced hunger and hardship, it was brutally reversed in 1834.
And the reversal was based entirely on this widely circulated government report, the Royal Commission Report, which falsely claimed the basic income led to mass idleness, moral decay, and widespread degeneracy among the poor.
And here is the key systemic failure that Bregman exposes. Historians later discovered that the vast majority of that Royal Commission report was fabricated. The secretary, Edwin Chadwick, was shrewd enough to obtain some tiny pieces of substantiating evidence, but he had the entire authoritative 500-page report written before the data was even fully collected or analyzed.
So the myth that giving money to the poor makes them lazy was literally built on a lie, manufactured by an authoritative government body in 1834.
And yet, because it confirmed the pre-existing belief that poverty was a moral failing, that lie became institutional dogma.
It's just astonishing how long-lasting the influence of a powerful lie can be.
That myth persisted, influencing 20th century American policy decades later. Nixon's family assistance plan for UBI was torpedoed partly because conservatives, advised by figures like Martin Anderson, successfully cited the fabricated Speenham land disaster as historical precedent.
As guaranteed failure.
And it continued through the 1980s, leveraged by Charles Murray and George Gilder, culminating in the Clinton-era welfare reform in 1996.
Which dismantled the system based on the narrative that poverty required punitive measures and work requirements, not cash assistance.
The language used during that 1996 reform was directly traceable back to that 1834 lie.
The system is kept alive by self-reinforcing feedback loops.
The pressure to work 40-plus hours in often meaningless jobs leads directly to exhaustion, stress, and burnout, a modern epidemic.
And this exhaustion reduces cognitive bandwidth and our capacity for the utopian, imaginative thinking necessary to challenge the status quo. We are too tired to dream.
And within institutions, universities, hospitals, politics, journalism quality is sacrificed for measurable quantity. We chase the number of publications, the daily audience shares, or quarterly GDP growth, regardless of the true utility.
This is the technocratic trap. We're so busy measuring and managing the existing flawed system, optimizing the treadmill, that we lack the time or bandwidth to step back and ask if we're measuring the right things.
Or even if the treadmill should exist at all. We confuse activity with value.
The ultimate result is the dystopia we live in today, the bleak paradise. The advertising industry encourages us to spend money we don't have on junk we don't need, leading to debt and profound dissatisfaction.
We then turn to doctors, therapists, and job coaches for the resulting stress and debt. It's a collective problem, a system failure. But the blame is always placed squarely on the individual.
Telling them they simply need to work harder or manage their stress better.
Let's connect these structural patterns to contemporary life and the present-day implications. We discuss the failure to achieve Keynes' leisure-filled future.
Right. Modern technology, far from freeing us, has trapped us. The advent of the smartphone means manager and professionals are constantly on call.
They are effectively monitoring work for 80 to 90 hours per week.
Bregman provides the shocking metric. The smartphone alone adds an average of 460 hours of work per year for the average employee who has access to work email or communications after hours.
That's more than 11 standard work weeks added purely by digital tethering.
This perpetual connection sustains the work ethic dogma even when the work is meaningless. Meanwhile, automation is accelerating, leading to labor market polarization.
While the Luddites in the 1830s were premature in their fears that technology would eliminate all work, the underlying structural risk is now a reality.
The risk today isn't necessarily mass unemployment tomorrow, but polarization, this widening structural gap between lousy jobs and lovely jobs.
Right, the low-skilled, minimum-wage service jobs and the creative, highly paid, highly credentialed ones.
The middle-skilled jobs that formed the bedrock of the 20th century middle class are eroding fast.
It's the draft horse phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's a powerful analogy. At the start of the 20th century, there were over 1 million draft horses in England.
Okay.
They were made obsolete not by sudden unemployment, but by motorized vehicles that slowly, steadily ate away at their earnings until they couldn't even pay for their own food or keep themselves in profitable work.
Today's sideline population, people who are eager to work but unemployable at any wage in the new economy, they face a similar fate.
They can't compete with sophisticated Asian, African, or increasingly robot labor, and the system offers no structural place for them.
And if we look at the welfare system, the persistence of that laziness myth leads to deep welfare stigma and bureaucratic complexity.
The current perverse system requires claimants to constantly demonstrate their shortcomings, how sick they are, how low their chances of being hired are, to officials.
It creates a noxious fog of suspicion, treating the claimant like a criminal rather than a person experiencing a temporary lack of cash.
And this labyrinthine bureaucracy is actively counterproductive. It targets precisely those whose mental bandwidth is already compromised by scarcity.
Economists assume poor students will rationally apply for beneficial programs like scholarships.
But the cognitive burden of navigating complex forms, appeals, and endless bureaucratic checks causes massive friction.
Bregman notes that some scholarships see only 30% of qualified candidates applying.
Because the burden of paperwork and proving you are deserving is too high when you are already in the scarcity trap, barely coping with daily life. This friction ensures that the help that does exist often fails to reach those who need it most.
Finally, we see the high cost of inequality itself.
Yeah, researchers Wilkinson and Pickett developed an index correlating inequality within wealthy nations with social problems.
And they found there's virtually no correlation between a country's per capita GDP, how rich it is, and its social problem index, murder rates, obesity, distrust, mental health.
Instead, social problems correlate almost perfectly with inequality within the country.
The U.S., the richest superpower, rates alongside Portugal, which has less than half the GDP, for the highest incidence of social problems.
More unequal societies are objectively worse places to live.
This suggests that once a basic level of wealth is achieved, more inequality leads to worse societal outcomes, even for the rich.
Status anxiety and chronic stress increase for everyone, because we all become more preoccupied with how others see us and where we stand in a highly stratified, constantly judgmental society.
Let's pull back now and see how Bregman's arguments fit into broader themes of systems, perception, and power. We are living in the land of plenty, but we are bound by scarcity thinking.
The system is fundamentally anachronistic. The outdated welfare system, for example, is keyed to a time when economies couldn't support a comfortable existence for everyone, the time of mercantilism.
So it assumed a need to force people into labor because production was scarce.
Exactly. Today, that assumption is empirically false due to technological abundance, yet the system persists because the moral narrative of work remains dominant.
This brings us back to the central theme, how imagination constrains social possibility.
Bregman refers to the theory of cognitive dissonance. People use their intellect not to find the correct answer, but to defend what they want to be the answer, often their pre-existing belief system.
And this is often why attempts to change hearts and minds with mere facts fail. Surprisingly, highly educated people are often more unshakable in their convictions.
Because education gives them better tools and more sophisticated arguments to defend pre-existing beliefs.
So when you're confronted with evidence contrary to your worldview, like the Mincome data, you defend the fortress of ideology tooth and nail.
This is the context that explains the dramatic success of the neoliberal movement in the late 20th century. Bregman recounts the lesson of Mont Pelerin.
This is where Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman gathered in 1947.
Their ideas were radical and fringe at the time, arguing for massive deregulation and privatization.
Their ideas were not mainstream, but they dedicated decades to developing and disseminating these alternatives, waiting for the right moment.
Friedman famously said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around.
The neoliberal movement succeeded because they made sure their ideas were meticulously developed and lying around when the economic crisis of stagflation hit in the 1970s.
Now contrast that strategic preparation with the 2008 financial collapse. That was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance.
The former high priest of deregulation, Alan Greenspan, admitted a fundamental flaw in his faith in free market capitalism. The consensus was shattered.
But the political failure was so profound, it led to a state of what we might call zombie politics, a deep, dreamless sleep, or a coma.
No fundamental structural change occurred because no well-developed, viable alternatives, no guidepost utopias were lying around to replace the discredited status quo.
The crisis wasn't a moment of truth because the political imagination had been drained.
And this failure to adapt is often masked by the persistence of seemingly objective metrics, the most dangerous of which is the gross domestic product, or GDP.
GDP is a system that persists long after its original purpose has disappeared. It was invented purely for wartime production needs during WWII.
It proved to be an excellent yardstick for measuring war power and industrial capacity.
But it is a terrible metric for measuring social welfare or human flourishing.
Simon Kuznets, the brilliant young professor who laid the foundation for the GDP in the 1930s, he even warned Congress that the welfare of a nation could scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income.
Yet we treat it as the single source of truth about a country's success.
The irony is rich because GDP is blind to crucial elements of well-being, like community service, clean air, volunteer work, and equality.
Perversely, it counts mental illness, crime, and pollution as positive additions because money is spent on solving those problems.
To put it vividly, GDP loves it if you crash your car because money is spent on repairs, hospital visits, and lawyers.
It hates it if you spend the afternoon walking in a clean park with your neighbor because no money changed hands. The system literally tells us that the worst families are those who function as families, cooking their own meals and taking walks.
Because those activities don't contribute to commercial consumption.
What's even more alarming and contributed directly to the 2008 crisis, is the subjective methodological choice made in the 1970s to measure bank productivity.
This choice essentially allowed bankers to mark their own homework.
They calculated their output based on the risks they were taking and the complexity of the products they created.
This one calculation massively inflated the financial sector's contribution to GDP, convincing politicians that banking was as valuable as the entire manufacturing industry.
The faster and looser they played with the economy, the more value they were supposedly adding to the GDP score.
As the Financial Times reported, it's plausible to speculate that had banking been correctly measured or subtracted from GDP rather than inflated,
The sector's supposed value would have been exposed as illusory long before 2008, and the crisis might have been avoided. This demonstrates that our reality is shaped by the metrics we choose to live by.
To conclude this deep dive into Utopia for Realists, we need to summarize the key structural failures Bregman identifies that keep us locked in the bleak paradise.
First, the adherence to the belief that work is inherently virtuous, regardless of its utility. This leads to the systemic proliferation of pointless, value-shifting jobs and the exhaustion of the collective workforce.
Second, the fallacy that poverty is a moral or character defect, sustained by that fabricated Speen-Hamlin myth. This prevents us from implementing pragmatic, evidence-based solutions like UBI and leads to debilitating welfare systems built on suspicion and complexity.
And third, the adherence to outdated metrics and systems like GDP and the mandatory 40-hour workweek that are long past their expiry date and actively misrepresent the true sources of value and well-being in a society of technological abundance.
Bregman frames utopia not as some naive fantasy, but as the practical and necessary pursuit of alternative horizons built on solid evidence drawn from history and modern psychology.
We need to be the single opposing voice that can shatter the pressure of conformity.
Without that utopian vision, built on the evidence of what is realistically possible, all that remains is the dull, technocratic management of a bleak status quo.
A coma where we lack the vocabulary and the collective will to demand something better than mere survival.
This leaves us with a final provocative thought. The book suggests that true progress requires us to value ends above means and prefer the good to the useful. The enormous talent pool currently wasted on wealth shifting, advertising, and hyper-complex financial product creation, the lawyers, the math whizzes, the PR experts, is a huge opportunity cost. Imagine if we could free that talent and redirect it toward real, tangible innovation, solving climate change, curing cancer, building sustainable cities, or pushing the boundaries of space exploration. What kind of marvelous age might we immediately unlock if we collectively prioritized human value over systemic utility? Our deep dive today was based on the extraordinary book Utopia for Realists, The Case for a Universal Basic Income, Open Borders, and a 15-Hour Workweek by Rutger Bregman.
We highly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author, or check your local library to explore these ideas further.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.